The chamber was built to end wars with words. It floated in the void between empires, anchored not to a star or a system, but to agreement itself, a place where violence had been replaced by language so precise it could redraw borders without a single shot fired. The Galactic Council spire rose like a shard of frozen light, its vast crystalline walls refracting distant galaxies into fractured colors that no single species could fully perceive the same way. Inside, the air, if it could even be called that, carried a sterile stillness. No scent. No temperature shifts. Just controlled equilibrium, engineered to accommodate beings made of flesh, energy, plasma, and things far less definable. Every sound was deliberate here. Every silence, enforced. For millennia, this chamber had never failed. Wars had arrived here as fire, and left as treaties. Entire civilizations had stood on the edge of annihilation, only to be reshaped by carefully chosen words spoken beneath this endless ceiling of watching stars. Conflict was not allowed to survive in this place. It was dissected. Translated. Resolved. That was the purpose. That was the promise. And that was why what happened next felt impossible. At the center platform, an obsidian circle polished to mirror perfection, stood a single human. Ambassador Elias Varn. Unarmed. Unarmored. Alone. Above him, the council tiers stretched outward in vast concentric rings, each filled with representatives of species that had outlived their own homeworlds, their wars, their histories. Some sat in towering forms carved from living stone. Others flickered as contained storms of light. A few existed only as distortions, ripples in the air where reality bent around their presence. All of them were watching him. Not with curiosity. With expectation. Because they already believed they knew how this would end. Another negotiation. Another compromise. Another war dissolved into carefully structured agreement. Elias could feel the weight of it pressing down, not physically, but psychologically. The certainty of the room. The quiet assumption that no matter what had happened, it could be solved here. It always had been. Behind him, suspended in a holographic arc, fragments of data flickered, brief, unstable glimpses of something he refused to look at directly. Images that didn't belong in this chamber. Destruction that words should have prevented. He closed his eyes for a moment. Not to gather courage. To hold something back. Because this place was designed for control, for measured responses, for diplomacy that sanded down the edges of anger until nothing sharp remained. But what he carried into this chamber was not meant to be softened. When he opened his eyes again, the stillness felt different. Thinner. Like something invisible had begun to crack beneath the surface. The council was waiting. The galaxy was waiting. For the right words. For the right tone. For the predictable outcome that had defined this place for longer than humanity had existed. Elias stepped forward. The sound of his boot touching the obsidian platform echoed farther than it should have, sharp, precise, final. And in that moment, something shifted. Not in the chamber. Not in the council. But in the idea of what this place was meant to do. Because for the first time in its history, someone had entered the chamber of peace. Not to end a war. But to refuse the very language that made peace possible. The council spire did not orbit a star. It commanded the silence between them. Suspended in a region of engineered vacuum stabilized by gravity lattices older than recorded history, the structure existed like a wound in space held open by will alone. Its crystalline framework stretched beyond natural geometry, vast arcs and impossible angles folding inward upon themselves, as if the building refused to accept that distance should have limits. This was not a station. It was a statement. Inside, the grand arbitration chamber expanded in layered tiers, each ring occupied by a different civilization, each one convinced, in its own way, that it represented order. Some were massive, towering entities anchored into gravitational seats that bent under their mass. Others hovered weightless, their forms shifting between states of matter as easily as thought. A few were not visible at all, represented only by interface distortions and translated voice fields that rippled through the air like pressure in water. And at the center of all of them stood humanity. Ambassador Elias Varn felt the scale of it before he fully saw it. Not because of size alone, but because of presence. The chamber was designed to overwhelm the concept of individuality. Every surface, every angle, every emission of light or sound was calibrated to make a single truth unavoidable: no one being here mattered more than the collective. Except, today, that assumption was strained. Elias stood on the obsidian platform at the chamber's core, its surface so polished it reflected fractured versions of the council above him, distorted gods staring down at their own imperfect reflection. His uniform carried no insignias of aggression, no ceremonial armor, no symbols of intimidation. Just fabric, reinforced for vacuum transit, marked only by Earth's minimal diplomatic seal. A symbol of restraint. Or, depending on interpretation, vulnerability. Above him, a holographic construct unfolded across the chamber ceiling, a rotating galactic map rendered in precise, cold clarity. Star systems pulsed like synapses in a vast neural network. Trade routes shimmered. Military zones flickered in controlled gradients of authority. And then there was Earth. Small. Blue. Quietly highlighted. Not central. Not dominant. Not even particularly important in the architecture of the map. A peripheral system labeled in soft tones reserved for developing civilizations. Elias looked at it anyway. Not because it mattered to them, but because it mattered to him. Behind him, subtle shifts rippled through the chamber. Council representatives adjusted posture, recalibrated attention, re-evaluated probability models. The presence of a single human should not have required this much focus, but something about the current variables refused to settle into expected outcomes. Humanity had not behaved according to pattern. That alone made them inefficient. And inefficiency, in this place, was treated as instability. A low-frequency hum built beneath the chamber floor, barely perceptible, but constant. It was the sound of systems maintaining equilibrium across impossible scales: gravity correction, atmospheric balancing, cognitive translation synchronization. Every word spoken here was processed through layers of interpretation before meaning could even exist. Elias knew this. He also knew what it cost. Because every system designed to make understanding universal, also made misunderstanding invisible. Above him, the galactic map shifted slightly as new data streams updated Earth's profile in real time. Resource indices. Population density. Technological progression curves. All of it filtered. All of it reduced. All of it neatly categorized into something the Council believed it could manage. Elias exhaled slowly. The sound was almost lost in the chamber's controlled silence. Almost. Because somewhere in the upper tiers, something noticed it. Not the breath itself, but the intent behind it. And for the first time since he had entered the spire, the Council began to pay attention not to what humanity was saying, but to what it might mean if they stopped speaking entirely. The moment the proposal appeared above the chamber floor, the atmosphere changed. Not dramatically. Not visibly. But in a way every advanced mind in the room immediately registered as dangerous. The holographic construct expanded slowly, too smoothly, too confidently, unfolding into a structured resolution framework labeled in Council standard syntax. Earth incident, containment through diplomatic integration. To any outside observer, it looked reasonable. Controlled. Even compassionate. But Elias Varn knew better. Because he had read what wasn't being said. The chamber's translation system softened the language on purpose, stripping away the raw edges of meaning until it became something palatable to civilizations that preferred order over truth. Containment became protection. Control became stability. Occupation dissolved into integration. It was always the same pattern. Just dressed differently each time. Above him, the council arbiter spoke again, its voice layered through a dozen interpretive filters, each one smoothing intent into something acceptable. The Earth origin incident is regrettable, it stated calmly. However, escalation cycles indicate that unrestricted retaliation will result in systemic instability across 3 adjacent sectors. A pause. Therefore, controlled oversight is the optimal corrective measure. The word settled into the chamber like law being written into reality. Around the tiers, council representatives reacted with varying degrees of approval. Some recalculated threat matrices. Others disengaged entirely, satisfied that equilibrium had been restored without unnecessary disruption. A few showed what might have been curiosity, but even that was diluted by centuries of procedural conditioning. Everything, here, was designed to converge toward resolution. Conflict was not allowed to persist. Only managed versions of it. Elias felt something tighten in his chest as the proposal expanded further. New layers unfolded, jurisdictional authority transfers, resource oversight allocations, communication restrictions. Entire sections of human sovereignty being rewritten in real time, as if Earth were not a participant in the conversation, but a variable being adjusted. Behind him, faint holographic echoes of Earth's situation flickered again, brief, incomplete flashes that the chamber systems had not fully suppressed. Cities burning. Orbital debris fields. Silence where transmission had once been. He did not look directly at them. He didn't need to. Because what mattered more than what had already happened, was what was about to be decided. This action ensures preservation of the species, another council voice added, clinical and detached. Humanity will be guided toward compliance within acceptable developmental parameters. Guided. Elias almost smiled at that. A small, fractured thing. The word implied consent. Partnership. Mutual direction. But nothing about this chamber had ever involved mutual anything. He shifted his weight slightly. The obsidian beneath his boots reflected not just his form, but the distorted silhouettes of those watching him, towering shapes that believed themselves distant, untouchable, final. They were used to civilizations breaking into one of 2 outcomes. Submission, or extinction. Humanity was being processed for neither. And that, more than anything, unsettled them. The proposal reached its final stage. A single command line pulsed at the bottom of the projection. Authorize integration protocol. All it required was consensus. A collective affirmation from beings who had long since replaced moral judgment with procedural efficiency. Elias felt the silence stretch. Not empty. Waiting. He could sense it now, the subtle shift in attention density across the chamber. Not hostility. Not fear. Curiosity edged with uncertainty. Because somewhere, beneath all their calculations, the council was beginning to register a deviation they couldn't yet quantify. Humanity was not reacting according to containment logic. There was no outrage that followed expected escalation curves. No surrender that matched predictive models. No negotiation pattern that aligned with historical analogs. Just stillness. Intentional stillness. And in a place where every civilization eventually revealed its strategy through reaction. Stillness was the most unpredictable behavior of all. I have a 6-paragraph cinematic sci-fi story. Each paragraph represents a unique part of the storyline, e.g., hook, setup, conflict, twist, climax, or ending. I want you to expand only paragraph number 5 into a highly immersive, cinematic narrative of around 500 words. Your goal. Keep the tone intense and emotionally engaging. Add realistic world building, sensory detail, internal thoughts, and slow-paced tension. Maintain consistency with the original paragraph's purpose, e.g., hook should remain a powerful opening, twist should feel shocking, ending should hit emotionally. Use film trailer level narration style, powerful, clear, and gripping. Make sure the paragraph feels like a complete scene on its own while still being connected to the overall storyline. Now expand paragraph number 5. I have a 6-paragraph cinematic sci-fi story. Each paragraph represents a unique part of the storyline, e.g., hook, setup, conflict, twist, climax, or ending. I want you to expand only paragraph number 6 into a highly immersive, cinematic narrative of around 500 words. Your goal: keep the tone intense and emotionally engaging. Add realistic world building, sensory detail, internal thoughts, and slow-paced tension. Maintain consistency with the original paragraph's purpose, e.g., hook should remain a powerful opening, twist should feel shocking, ending should hit emotionally. Use film trailer level narration style, powerful, clear, and gripping. Make sure the paragraph feels like a complete scene on its own while still being connected to the overall storyline. The moment did not begin with a command. It began with absence. Across the council spire, every automated defense grid that had instinctively powered up in response to the unknown signatures, stalled. Not shut down. Not disabled. Just unable to proceed. Like a thought interrupted mid-formation. Outside the chamber, the silhouettes in deep space remained motionless, vast, dark structures holding position along the edge of known civilization. They did not advance. They did not retreat. They simply existed in a formation that defied every tactical model the Council had ever developed. And that was the problem. There was no tactical model for something that refused to behave like an opponent. Inside the chamber, Elias Varn felt the shift in real time. Not through sensors. Through silence. The Council was no longer reacting with confidence. No longer issuing coordinated directives. Instead, fragmented bursts of command flickered through translation layers, colliding, overriding, canceling each other out before they could stabilize into action. Target lock, failed. Recalculate vector, invalid geometry. Engagement authorization, pending contradiction resolution. The words meant nothing together. And less apart. Elias looked up slowly as the projection above the chamber fractured again. The unknown structures outside had begun to move, not toward the council spire, not toward Earth, but into a pattern that wrapped around both like a boundary being drawn after the fact. Not an invasion route. A perimeter. The realization spread unevenly through the chamber. Some council members attempted to initiate diplomatic channels. Others triggered contingency doctrines. A few simply froze, their cognitive systems struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with anything they had been trained to understand. Because everything about this encounter violated the core assumption of council existence. That intelligence equals predictability. And predictability equals control. But there was no control here. Only observation. A Kareth warnode finally forced an override through internal resistance protocols and launched a full-spectrum targeting sweep. The beam arrays charged, energy signatures building to catastrophic output levels designed to erase entire fleets from existence in a single synchronized strike. And then... nothing. Not explosion. Not interference. Just refusal. The firing solution dissolved before discharge. Not jammed. Not blocked. Rejected by the system itself as if the act of firing had become logically incompatible with reality. A ripple of alarm spread through Council defense architecture. Weapon systems not responding to command hierarchy. Autonomous override protocols failing. Causality conflict detected. The chamber lights dimmed further as auxiliary systems diverted power into stabilizing collapsing logic layers. Even the spire itself seemed uncertain how to maintain structural coherence in the presence of something that did not obey the assumption of cause and effect in a linear way. Elias spoke quietly, his voice cutting through the rising noise. "You're trying to fight something you haven't defined yet." No one responded. Not because they disagreed, but because disagreement required a stable definition of the thing being discussed. And they did not have one. Outside, the unknown formations shifted again, barely perceptible, but absolute in implication. The perimeter tightened, not aggressively, but decisively, like a conclusion being written around the council rather than imposed upon it. A senior delegate finally whispered, almost to itself. "They are not engaging us." A pause. "They are containing our options." That sentence did not trigger panic. It triggered something far worse. Comprehension. Because for the first time in the Council's recorded history, the galaxy was not being divided into friend, foe, or neutral. It was being divided into what could still be understood, and what no longer fit inside understanding at all. And humanity, still silent within the chamber, was no longer the center of the equation. It was simply the last known variable that still made sense. The silence that followed was not empty. It was structured. As if the universe itself had paused to allow something irreversible to be understood. Inside the Galactic Council spire, alarms no longer sounded with urgency. They pulsed weakly now, stripped of meaning, repeating alerts that no one was fully processing anymore. The Great Chamber, once designed to convert chaos into negotiation, had become a place where negotiation itself no longer had a target. Outside, the unknown formations held their position around known space like an equation finally balanced. Not tightening. Not attacking. Simply maintaining structure, an invisible geometry imposed over the galaxy's assumed freedom. And within that structure, everything else felt suddenly temporary. Ambassador Elias Varn stood at the center of it all, no longer as a representative of Earth in a negotiation, but as a witness to the moment negotiation itself lost relevance. The council above him no longer looked unified. Their forms shifted in subtle instability, energy beings flickering, biological entities adjusting posture without meaning, entire species attempting to reconcile internal disagreement faster than it could form. There was no consensus left. Only fracture. A council arbiter attempted to speak, but the translation layer fractured mid-sentence. The words dissolved into incomplete concepts, protocol fragments without authority to finalize themselves. Even language was beginning to fail under the weight of what was happening. "Stabilize containment parameters," one voice ordered. But there was nothing left to contain. Because containment implied separation. And separation no longer existed in any meaningful way. Outside the spire, the unknown structures completed their silent formation. Not encircling the council in aggression, but in definition. As if the galaxy itself had been gently redrawn, and the council had only now realized it was no longer at the center of anything. It had become an interior detail. A subsystem. A region of observation inside something far larger than its comprehension models could simulate. Elias finally exhaled. Slowly. Not in relief. But in recognition. "They're not here to destroy you," he said quietly, his voice carrying through the chamber with a clarity that cut through the failing translation layers. "They're here because you assumed you were the highest authority in the room." No one responded. Because no one could determine whether he was correct, or whether correct still had operational meaning. Above them, the holographic galactic map attempted one final recalibration. Entire regions flickered out of classification. Trade networks collapsed into undefined geometry. Military zones lost their boundaries and became unresolvable noise. And Earth. Earth remained unchanged. Small. Blue. Unremarkable in size. But now, no longer isolated. Because something vast had quietly positioned itself between humanity and the rest of the galaxy, not as protector, not as conqueror, but as consequence. The Council systems attempted one final diagnostic sweep. Result: no valid frame of reference exists. That sentence repeated across every terminal, every interface, every consciousness-linked node. Not as warning. But as conclusion. Inside the chamber, the realization arrived without drama. No explosion of emotion. No sudden collapse into chaos. Just the slow, unavoidable understanding that everything built here, every law, every treaty, every assumption of hierarchy, had been constructed inside a model that was no longer complete. And somewhere in that quiet unraveling, humanity was no longer the subject of judgment. It was the point at which judgment itself stopped working. Elias turned slightly toward the open chamber doors. Behind him, the council did not speak. Ahead of him, the galaxy had already begun to reorganize itself around something none of them had voted for. And for the first time since the spire was built, no one in the galaxy knew who was supposed to speak next.